Yakuza Like a Dragon, or RGG7 as it was known in Japan, was a game released at the beginning of 2020 in Japan on the PS4, with it later coming to the rest of the world and on Xbox and PC at the end of 2020. It later apparently came to Japan for Xbox and PC at the start of 2021, which I didn't realise, but it also weirdly came to specifically PS5 in March of 2021, which I will elaborate on in a bit. It came out after the critically acclaimed Judgment and before the critically acclaimed Lost Judgment, so it is kind of met with some unfortunate expectations that it would be peak gaming. Before I move on, for simplicity, I'll just be referring to this game as either 7 or just Like a Dragon. By the way, for the whole video, the HUD's going to be cut off because this is a 16:9 video with 21:9 footage, but this is the closest I get to not having any HUD at all, so Bizarrely, this game took a bigger shift in gameplay than Dead Souls did, as it went from an action beat-em-up with RPG elements to a full turn-based RPG. This was exactly why I said in the last video that this is the most divisive game amongst fans, because in all honesty, you really do either love it or hate it. Unlike Dead Souls, this was supposed to be the 7th mainline entry and not some silly spin-off, so no wonder people were confused as all hell with this massive shift in gameplay. But rather than starting off on a negative note, I'm actually going to talk about the things of this game that the community are typically unified in liking. First of all, the soundtrack. It's epic. And I can't really think of any fun facts, but it's on Spotify and stuff, so go listen to it. Now then, we'll talk about an element that some people really like, and some people pretend not to like. The story of this game has some very obvious comparisons that are drawn between it and the first Yakuza game's story, such as the main character, Ichiban Kasuga, having a reverse suit and honestly a reverse personality of Kiryu. It's a very long story, and there's lots of dialogue scenes where they do spout a lot of exposition at you, but for a first since Yakuza 5, the game focuses a lot on the humanity within its characters. Ichiban is a very optimistic and cheerful person like Shinada from Yakuza 5, and his greatest concern isn't trying to be some top dog and make a lot of money, but instead his greatest priority is just trying to make his friends and family happy. It's genuinely refreshing to see such a focus on the relationships of characters in this game, and for those characters to recognize those relationships, unlike previous games. For example, Kiryu has plenty of drinks with Date, and there are a few moments in some side content where Kiryu spends some quality time with Majima, but there are some annoying instances of Date and Kiryu pretending like they're just colleagues, and Majima getting shafted so often in stories and obviously having him proclaim to the player every 5 seconds that Kiryu isn't his brother because Saejima exists. This isn't necessarily a criticism of the writing of the stories and whatever, because Kiryu and Date can't exactly go get pissed at the pub together, although the Majima bit is a criticism. Screw your traditions. Kiryu, Majima and Saejima, they should just be the three amigos. You know the cabaret club minigames? The ones where you talk to the girls? Imagine that thing, but instead of talking to these random people who will only ever be there in the one game, imagine if instead you had a series of mini-games across all the games where you sit down and have some drinks with Date or Kashiwagi, or, and not to sound like Shindo, have some tea with Daigo's mum. Or in Yakuza 4 you can sit down with Hana as Akiyama, or as Shinada you can have chats with all of his mates. Imagine if you could do all of that to get to know the characters more and to become closer with them, you know? Sounds pretty cool, right? You're right. It is cool, which is exactly why Like a Dragon did that exact thing. Being the person that he is, Ichiban fully embraces the love he has for his friends and family several times throughout the game, and thanks to this, there are many scenes throughout the game where you might get a bit teary-eyed because of these beautiful bonds that the game portrays. Ichiban's not at all the brains of his party, but he is most certainly the heart, and by allowing the players the opportunity to interact with party members with the bar chats or little chats you have on the street, it makes it very easy to love these people as much as Ichiban does. And to further emphasize this point of Ichiban's bonds, I'd like to quickly show one scene in particular that always stands out in my mind.
That guy back there is more than a friend. The only thing I would call him now is a brother!
By the way, if you couldn't guess from that clip, yes, this game does have an English dub. The dub this time around has some reanimated faces and mouth movements that sync with the English dub, which the previous game Judgment and the next game Lost Judgment did not have. The dub, just like Judgment, is incredibly good. However, unlike Judgment, I can understand a lot more if someone were to just pick the Japanese audio for the game. This is because some of the returning characters from previous games, like Majima, just sounding off in English, regardless of who played him. Or characters like Ichiban, voiced by Keiji Tang in English, whose existence was basically made to be played by the voice actor of Nishiki from the older games, Kazuhiro Nakaya. So in that sense, some of the English voice actors were put between a rock and a hard place with portraying these characters, but I still think that they did a good job in their own ways. Someone like Matthew Mercer, who plays Majima, is a phenomenal actor, but even if they got God himself to play Majima, he still wouldn't be as good as Hidden Ariogaki. The line I showed earlier was a line for just the English dub too, as a lot of the script was rewritten. Not in a way that changes the story at all, but just in the sense that Japanese and English are two very different languages, so sometimes a direct translation wouldn't fit. I didn't point it out in my video on Judgment, even though I definitely should have, sorry Scott, but Judgment, Like a Dragon, Lost Judgment, and maybe Fist of the North Star, Lost Paradise, but I don't remember, each have two entirely separate subtitle tracks. I don't know what it's like in other languages, but in English there is a set of subtitles for all the spoken dialogue for the English dub, and then a separate set of subtitles for the Japanese dub. I don't know if all of those scenes where you can skip to the next line by hitting X, or just the dialogue scenes as I call them, have separate subtitles, or if all of the dialogue that's said during battles has different subtitles, but I definitely know that all of the properly done cutscenes do exactly that. This is a big deal because a lot of the time when you play a game that provides the choice of either dub, the English subtitles are just set to match the English dub, which a lot of the time needs some heavily altered dialogue to match lip flaps and whatever else. The dialogue between dubs isn't really too different for these games regardless, but it shows the attention to detail that these developers and localizers have for their games, and so fortunately, you have the super accurate subtitles when you play in Japanese, and the spot-on subtitles when you play in English, so good on you Sega, you get a big thumbs up from me. But anyway, another English versus Japanese difference with this game is the box art. Now most of the games do have different regional box arts. For example, Judgment in the East had all of the likeness characters plus the mole, whereas Judgment in the West has Yagami with the cool glass shattering effect, with Yagami whispering, which doesn't really fit the game, but I mean it looks cool, so who cares. And then another example was Yakuza 3 with its cool Japanese box art, and then whatever the hell the English one was. But with Like a Dragon, the Japanese box art was very similar to the Judgment one, where it basically contained all of the likeness characters and then the rest of the party. I think this one's a bit shithouse because it makes these three look like the three main villains, even though one's a party member, one's your dad, and one's your uncle who just kinda hates you. The Western one, on the other hand, which I learned only recently, was actually made by the Western team and wasn't some alternative box art the Japanese team whipped out after the initial release, and it showcases the game a lot more than the Asian one. It captures the overall silliness of the game, but also has the whole Arakawa family off in the background, as well as Nancy, who is a crawfish. Not only does the Western art capture more of the essence of the game, it's also significantly more eye-catching, and even though I don't own an Xbox and my eyesight is heinously awful, if ever I was at an EB Games around 2020 and 2021, I would always see Like a Dragon in the corner of my eye and just go, hell yeah. But interestingly, the Japanese team obviously liked the box art too, which would explain why the cover art for the soundtrack of Yakuza Like a Dragon has the Western box art, as well as it becoming the cover of the international version of the game, which was released in Japan. From what I gather, Asia, or at least Japan, never got any physical versions of the game on Xbox or PC, both of which make sense because the only guy in all of Japan who owns an Xbox is probably Masahiro Sakurai, and then also because physical versions of PC games sort of passed away a long time ago, so we didn't even get one, I don't think. But the reason the global PS5 version, as well as the Asian Xbox and PC versions, didn't come out until about a year after the initial PS4 release, and a handful of months after the Western release, was because Asia pretty much got the English version of the game. So essentially, the game came out in the East, then got ported to the West, then that version got ported back to the East, and was rebranded as the international version of the game on PS5. I don't think Xbox and PC got the international version title, and considering they were digital only, they were probably able to be chucked out much earlier than the PS5 version. With this international version, the East got the English dub, the Western box art, and then most likely whatever bug fixes and other changes were made post the two initial launches. Also, the Japanese subtitles would have likely been given the same treatment as the English ones, where there were two subtitle tracks for both dubs. But then obviously in the West, all we got was simply the PS5 version of the game, and there was nothing really special or different about it, but it does explain the delay. And that is the extent of my knowledge, because I don't know if the Asian PS4 versions ever got updates to add the English dub or not, but I still thought to bring this all up because it's quite interesting that Sega of America and Japan were basically playing tennis with each other, passing the game to and from. But now for the actually important thing, because it's a video game, being the gameplay. In this game, you get to play in the iconic Kamurocho, the slowly becoming just as iconic but just not yet as iconic Sotenbori, and the brand new area of Yokohama. Yokohama is probably the biggest area that the series has had so far, and as with most other locations, was lovingly recreated from Yokohama in real life. This game also added the ability to be hit by a car. Yep, originally I wasn't actually going to go into much more detail than it's turn-based, because I can't really compare this to previous games, as most of this is brand new. However, there are many elements that are from the previous games that have been adapted in a slightly different context, with that context obviously being a turn-based RPG. For example, this game still has long battles, but they're treated more like dungeons. There are actual sewer dungeons you can head into, called dungeons, but there are also the classic levels where you run through something like a building, beating people up as you go until eventually you get to a boss, just like a long battle from the other games. But anyway, if I go into detail about the gameplay in this video, I could then use this video as a reference point for when Infinite Wealth comes out to compare and analyze that game, so yeah, allow me to explain how the game works. The first little thing I'll mention is that, curiously, this game does not have an easy difficulty. This is in quite the contrast to Judgment, which had simple difficulty, where it was essentially just easy, but every time you pressed the light attack button, the game would do everything for you. But then for Like a Dragon, hard and legend difficulty only seem to be selectable in New Game Plus. And the reason I bring that up is because there was probably a very good reason to not include an easy difficulty, which you might be able to see what I mean later in this video. But regardless, being a turn-based RPG means that this plays very differently from previous entries. Like with most RPGs, you have a party, and this one consists of Ichiban and 6 of his mates, meaning that you have a party of 7, which also means that this game continues the gag that Yakuza 4, 5, and technically Kiwami 2 had, where the number of the game is equal to the number of playable characters. Except, you can't run around as all 7 freely, nor do you swap to them periodically in the story, as instead you control Ichiban 100% of the time, and the other 6 you can only control in battle. In battle, you rather annoyingly still can't move around as those other party members, because you actually can't move around at all in a fight, and instead everyone automatically moves around on their own. This is something that I beg to the Sega gods above gets addressed in the sequel, but anyway. In combat, everyone has the options of special attacks, the Etika Joy-Con Boys for Life menu, guard, and a basic attack. This has been known for a while, but cleverly the commands spell out Sega, but also the colors of the words actually correspond with the face buttons of your controller, although PC and Switch controls just get the same colors as the Xbox ones. Everyone, when doing an attack, can kick an environmental object towards the enemy, which is exactly like when you press heavy attack near an item in previous games. Ichiban, when he attacks, has the ability to actually pick up objects automatically, so long as his target is near something like a bike or whatever, but because of how you can't control anyone while you fight, doing any of this shit is bullshit and difficult as hell. Sometimes when you do an attack, a party member can follow it up, but also when you do a regular attack on an enemy on the ground, you can do some more damage. If you attack an enemy when there's another one in the way, they will smack you in the back of the head, get their ass banned. Unlike other turn-based RPGs, all of the attacks in this game still rely on hitboxes, so sometimes your attack will miss because it quite literally missed. There are still random chances for an attack to miss, which are normally indicated by an animation of your character rolling out of the way or something, but sometimes you'll get stuck on something, or the AI will just not get close enough and swing right in front of their nose, and bam, you missed. In quite the similarity, escaping from battles is not determined by any stats or values, but instead you will get a guaranteed escape if there is nothing in your path when your character does this little runaway animation. So if you run straight into a wall or other object, you won't escape. But if you can keep running with no interruptions, guaranteed escape. Moving on though, within the Etch-a-Sketch menu, you have access to items that can heal you or that you can use as an attack, such as a gun or a grenade, or you can swap out an active party member with a reserve one. By the way, as you can see from this clip, you can 100% hit your own party members, but same goes for the enemy. Ichiban also gains access to a bunch of summons, like in Final Fantasy for example, which you can use to do various things. Ichiban cannot be removed from the party, and rather unfortunately, when he dies, you get a game over. But fortunately, one of his main jobs does get an overpowered ability where you pretty much can't die, so yeah, we're chilling. Speaking of the jobs, like in say Final Fantasy 3, 5, 12, and 14, and probably 11, I don't know, I've never played it, the party gain access to a number of jobs to change up their stats and skills. Although, in quite a clever way, these jobs aren't things like Ranger, White Mage, Dragoon, Mystic Knight, whatever, but instead are actual jobs like Chef, Bodyguard, Hostess, and so on. These jobs are divided into 2 categories, being jobs for the blokes and jobs for the boys and the girls. Everyone does get their own unique job, however, with the only exception being Ichiban, who gets 2, and there were also 2 DLC jobs I never bought, being one for the lads and one for the ladies. These jobs range from the host and hostess jobs, which are pretty bloody useful, to freelancer, which is just don't ever use it, trust me. Every job has a range of skills you can learn by gaining XP and leveling up the job, with a select few skills being ones that you can use on any class you want once unlocked. There's also equipable weapons, gear, and accessories, with the gear and accessories being universal so anyone can equip them, although some accessories might be for a specific job, as well as all weapons being only available for specific jobs. So for example, the hero class only gets bats, whereas the clerk class only gets box cutters. But once again, freelancer sucks because you can only use his bare hands, which means you can't get any attack bonuses for him, although the German suplex ability is pretty good. Now, something else that I hope gets addressed in the sequel is that with these jobs, there are no passive skills, but instead the closest thing you get are stat buffs, and so I would like to see some passives to further diversify the jobs, maybe? All of the skills that you can get, therefore, are active ones, which is what goes into the special attacks section. These all consume MP, which pretty much is the game's equivalent to heat. Similar to stuff like the Mario RPG games, all of these, when used, allow for extra damage to be acquired by either mashing one button or pressing the button at at a correct time. In a similar vein, if you press the guard button just as you get hit, you can do a little perfect block sort of thing, which will reduce the damage taken. There are also special Kiwami attacks, or extreme as they're called, but you see it's got Kiwami there, but anyway. These will all have little cutscenes attached to them, all of which are ridiculous, and most of which do a lot of damage. These pretty much are exactly like heat actions in the older games, with each button having one that straight up is a bunch of different heat actions. All of these attacks will use varying attack types. These are blunt, blade, and magic attacks, with magic also being able to have fire, water, or electric properties, although the water one is actually ice because there are a bunch of ice attacks that you can use, and I don't know why the hell they didn't just think to make it like a snowflake symbol, but it doesn't matter. There are also healing skills, as well as skills that will buff or debuff your target, whether it be with a status condition or a stat alteration, which, by the way, stats can also be altered outside of combat by eating at restaurants and stuff. But then also there are some very specific skills, like the host job essentially having steal from Final Fantasy, where you rob people. Enemies and your party members all have their own resistance to each of these attack attributes, as well as each party member having specific status conditions that they are completely immune to, like Namba being immune to catching a cold, or if not immune, then at the very least resistant. Ichiban actually gains increased resistances to different status conditions depending on his personality levels, which are these weird little things that were probably taken from Persona. Speaking of these status conditions, there's a lot of them in this game. There's silence, rage, charm, brainwashed, bleed, poison, cold, burn, sleep, stun, paralysis, and drunk. Most of these work exactly like they do in other RPGs, and all of them can be applied to both you and the enemy, and has the exact same effects across both parties. Damage type resistances are percentage based, which I assume also applies to the enemies, but because of how it operates, if you have a character with a 1% blade resistance versus a character with 50%, a bladed attack will obviously deal different amounts of damage, but it will say resist for both characters. So considering that a lot of the time, you can just sort of slowly walk up to the enemy and, give him a nice little look in the eye and say, "Fuck your resistances, dog." Head trauma. There's a lot of enemy variety, not in the sense that there are many different weaknesses or strategies you have to remember, but instead, visually, there are a lot of very unique designs, and the enemies range from soldiers to businessmen to Yakuza to whatever the bloody hell this thing is. But while enemies do have varying weaknesses and resistances, considering most of the time something that will say resist will probably just be like a 5% decrease, you can pretty much just ignore it and spam the same attack the entire time you play. There actually are a shitload of different skills across all of the different jobs and characters, and sometimes navigating through all of them takes a good 3 to 4 business days, but thankfully there is a shortcut system where you can use a skill at the push of a button. So basically with Jungi Han, you can just set up Head Trauma and Divine Shot as 2 of your shortcuts, and then just press those buttons over and over and win every single fight. Probably due to the fact that there are 700 skills, the balancing of all of them is quite very badly terribly poor, and the reason why it's been roughly 3 years and I still go on about Head Trauma is because that is Jungi Han's default lowest cost skill that he gets as soon as you get him, so long as he's in the Hitman job, and it is stupidly overpowered. It ends up making it so that many of the abilities are completely worthless as they consume more MP but deal less damage. Perfect example of which exists in the Freelancer class, where each bard has these 2 kicks, where they're both the same shit but one is better. Even the status conditions blur together and become kinda redundant. Bleed, poison, burn, and cold all pretty much do the exact same thing of damaging the enemy over time, compared to, say, what Pokemon does, where there exists burn, poison, and badly poison, with burn halving physical attack, regular poison dealing an 1/8 of damage each turn, and badly poison dealing 1/16 of damage on the first turn, then 2/16 on the second turn, and then it increases every time until they die or it gets healed. It further emphasizes the point that I've always made, where there's really no strategy to this game at all, and it doesn't really have any of the complex mechanics of other turn-based games or any unique battle aspects that set it apart from other RPGs. Basically, you just pick whatever's strongest and keep on attacking until either you win or you need to stop attacking for like 1 turn to heal, then you go back to attacking. But in all honesty, while I personally would have preferred a more complex RPG to come out of Like a Dragon, I can admit with 100% certainty that the simplicity of this game is actually a strength rather than a weakness. I mean, all of the Yakuza games are incredibly simple. You can get more complicated if you want, but there is a secret universal technique that when applied to any of the games and any of the encounters on any of the difficulties, that being... actually, hang on, wait. Let me just grab my controller. That being this. Yep, that's all you need to do. You just mash buttons. When you apply that strategy to Like a Dragon, it still works, so it's not like it's really any different from the previous games. You just pick whatever's the most consistent and do that until you win, easy peasy, and then if you need a heal, you just stop and heal. But the simplicity lends itself to far more accessibility to people who might struggle to play more action-focused games because of some sort of health problem like only having 1 arm or being a massive noob. If I wanted a more complex RPG, I would have gone and played one, but instead I played this. And I also have confidence that a lot of the problems in this game will be fixed in this game's sequel when it comes out next next year, and so I'm hopeful that in that game you can do things like move around during combat, or that the resistances and weaknesses of enemies play more of a part in strategies, because you really can just hit enemies with anything most of the time. But even if they don't, it will again lend itself to the fact that you can play this game leaning all the way back in your chair with your right hand on the controller and write names with your left hand, and then take a potato chip and eat. And despite the fact that I did have my own issues with it, I still did have a lot of fun. This is one of only a few games in this series that once I beat, I went back and continued playing for my own enjoyment, and not for any content purposes or anything like that. Even though it isn't as good as other RPGs, there isn't a single other RPG out there that has a benefit of being a Yakuza game. Its presentation, its style, its characters, music, side content, in many ways, it's quite unmatched. I can understand though people out there that won't like this game or don't really want to give it a go, and if you're one of those people, no one cares. But the game is very easy to recommend to people who are a bit more on the newbie side, as it's easily the most accessible Yakuza game, with its quite frankly low difficulty and its very simplistic gameplay. However, if you want a recommendation for a turn-based RPG, SMT4 on the 3DS. In all seriousness though, this was a new generation of Yakuza games because of both the fact that it's a completely different genre, but also because it's likely that we should expect to see more and more games exactly like this one from RGG Studio in the future. And I mean, we already have one, so hopefully we'll be getting more. While this is only applicable to the English side of things, this was also the last of this series to fall under the name of Yakuza. But now the series moves on into a significantly more unified experience where the two main teams responsible for creating these games actually fucking communicate with each other, and already a game such as Like a Dragon Ishin has shown that those two teams are definitely working together to create a more enjoyable experience, even though Yokoyama probably doesn't want to. But the truth that you'll find at the end of this very long road that this series has laid out over many years is that every single game in this franchise was really good until the 24th of September 2021 came around, and every single Yakuza game was outclassed by the best video game ever made, Lost Judgment. So if you enjoyed this video, like, subscribe, and join the channel please, because it would mean a lot. But stay tuned for the final part in this series, where I suck off Lost Judgment for however many minutes straight.